Thanks very much for that nice introduction. Do we know how to get the presentation on the screen? Are you going to do that, Elliot?
Yes, I'll turn it over to you. In fact, if you just click on the share screen
Okay.
and then just make sure you select your perfect. Yeah.
Getting the job done. Okay, great. Well,
It disappeared. If you can, yeah, thank you.
okay, great. Great. Sorry for the complication there. So today we're going to talk about the complicated topic of capital efficiency in rate making. Before getting rolling on this, I would like to say that this presentation has been prepared with money from Berkeley Lab and the U.S. Department of Energy, which is greatly appreciated because I had to give some thought to how to take some older slides and put them together in a way that properly addresses this complicated topic. Uh, the motivation for the topic is that U.S. electric utilities today are in a period of rapid change, and alternatives to traditional cost of service rate making, sometimes collectively referred to as Altreg, are increasingly used to address change. Amongst these changes are business conditions that encourage unusually high levels of capital expenditures. And so incentives for capital efficiency are a key concern when choosing between traditional cost of service rate making and various types of Altreg. And so in this presentation today, I want to particularly focus on the performance-based rate making approaches to Altreg and a couple of other salient Altreg options. And as I go through, I'm particularly putting a spotlight on the capital efficiency incentives that they yield. The main focus is going to be on electric utilities rather than gas utilities, although I will make some mention of gas utility regulation. And just generally, as a regulatory economist, my presentation will be infused with an economist perspective on contemporary rate making. So let's start by talking about how we find ourselves in what I like to call the age of Altreg. Business conditions facing many electric utilities today often create chronic financial attrition between rate cases. And a lot of what's driving this is concern about the effect of electric utility operations on the environment. And one of those impacts is that mounting climate concerns encourage today large demand-side management programs and also a lot of distributed generation on the customer side of the meter. And under legacy rate designs with their high usage charges, this is going to trim the throughput margins that utilities earn from load growth and that traditionally they've used to help finance their cost growth. There are also many reasons to boost capital expenditures or capex. And on top of everything else, in the last few years, there has been unusually rapid input price inflation. Now, under traditional cost of service rate making, these conditions will trigger frequent rate cases that have a number of disadvantages from the point of view of a regulatory economist. One is that they weaken utility incentives to contain costs of capital and other base rate or non-fuel inputs. The reason I don't mention the fuel inputs, purchase power and generation fuel, is that they already have weak incentives to contain those because of cost trackers. Frequent rate cases also raise regulatory cost, and to the extent that they do, they're distracting from a range of important generic issues that regulators face today, things like clean energy implementation plans and reconsideration of rate designs. And it's important to note that these business conditions and the frequency of rate cases is much less favorable than was the case in the golden age of COSR, which I like to date before the late 1960s, when COSR became a tradition. Now, with all these shortcomings, COSR has spurred the development of Altreg options. And the ones that you hear about the most are the ones that the utilities favor. And their primary goal in promoting these alternatives is accelerated revenue growth to come closer to matching their cost growth. And these include most notably fully forecasted test years, higher fixed charges, revenue decoupling, extra cost trackers, formula rates, and multi-year rate plans. I doubt if anyone who's listening today hasn't heard utilities asking for one, if not more, of these, or has already gained approval of them. Now, many utilities also prefer Altreg options that require advanced approval of their capex plans. And you'll note that they tend to be much more preoccupied with exact recovery of their capital costs than they are about the recovery of their O&M expenses. Now, the whole matter of utility capex is kind of a hot issue today, and sometimes even I'm surprised at how hot of an issue it is in some jurisdictions, because really capex clearly will play a very important role in the clean energy transition. After all, clean generation technologies are highly capital intensive, and low-cost renewables often are remotely located and they require transmission access. Beneficial electrification is likely to prompt capacity expansion, and a reliable, resilient, and smart grid is probably going to be essential all over the United States down the road. And in my opinion, some of the reason for this heightened controversy over capex is driven by vendors of alternatives to utility capex that include independent power producers and sellers of miscellaneous energy services, and their surrogates that are often very active in proceedings. That said, capex containment should nonetheless be a key concern of regulators for a couple of related and very important reasons. And that is, in an age of high capex, containing capex is a vital key to customer welfare, including the welfare of low-income customers. And it's also a key to public acceptance of a clean energy transition. I mean, there's going to be more pushback to clean energy transition, the more it's going to cost the customer. So let's now just take a step back and think, how might one go about incentivizing capital efficiency? Well, there are two fundamentally different, though related, approaches. And the first would be to weaken the utilities' incentive to spend money on capital. And this would be accomplished by making its revenue less sensitive to its own capex. And a couple of ways that this could be done: very competent prudence reviews. At the extreme, in a place like Great Britain, the utilities revenue requirement is based as much or more on the regulator's independent view of how much capex is really needed than it is on any proposal ventured by the utility. Another issue is that between general rate cases, what is the basis for capital revenue escalation? And to the extent that it is external, in the sense that it's not linked to the company's actual capex, it will heighten incentives to contain capex. Now, a whole nother approach to tackling this would be to strengthen utility incentives to use capex alternatives. And here, immediately, demand-side management looms large, although it's by no means the only one. But if you could encourage DSM and perhaps also distributed generation by removing that throughput incentive, that would be one thing. And you could also provide a positive incentive for DSM and any other kind of operation and maintenance practices that reduces the need for capex. So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach. Makes sense. And so there's no one simple way to strengthen capex incentives. By the way, I do want to chime in and say, before I go further, that you can ask questions during the presentation as well as at the end. So feel free to put some in the chat, and perhaps Elliot or Abigail could send them occasionally to me. All right, so now we're going to start in by talking about two approaches to Altreg that are not generally considered performance-based approaches, and they would be cost trackers and formula rates. And let's start with cost trackers. This is kind of almost regulatory economics 101. So a lot of you know about cost trackers, but some of you don't. So I'll just say that the basic idea is to expedite recovery of some targeted costs between general rate cases. And it's called a tracker because there will be some sort of a balancing account. Sometimes it's called a variance account that keeps track of the unrecovered costs. And then costs that are deemed prudent are usually recovered promptly via some sort of a rate surcharge or rider. And the most common approach use of cost trackers, as we all know, has been in tracking large volatile costs like those for fuel and purchase power expenses. I know that in Rhode Island, for example, another one might be pension and benefit expenses. But cost trackers are increasingly also used for rapidly rising costs just because they're rapidly rising. And at the top of this list is capex costs, the annual cost of capex, by which I mean things like the incremental depreciation expenses, taxes, and return on rate base that capex triggers. As for the precedents for capex trackers, you can see from this slide that it's a very widely used. In fact, it's the most popular form of Altreg in the United States. Although you'll notice that it may be a little bit less common for the electric utilities than it is for the gas utilities, partly because the gas utilities have these safety concerns that may tip the scales in their favor. Now, in general, I'm going to talk, when I talk about these options, in a certain amount of the pros and the cons. Just for heuristic reasons this time, I'm going to start the capex discussion with what's bad about it. And the bad part is that it weakens incentive to contain the capex that is tracked. And to make matters worse, the need for proposed capex is often hard for the regulator to assess, particularly in a case of a very deferrable type of thing like replacement capital spending. There is often also inadequate utility support for proposed capex. And then parties to regulation are always worried about information asymmetries between utilities and other parties. One of the concerns there is about something that's sometimes called single issue rate making. Utilities are very good about sticking under the regulator's nose anything that's causing them financial attrition without necessarily mentioning equal vigor the various things that are going well for them. And so sometimes people are concerned that they'll get money when they don't really need as much money as they're asking for. There's less concern about that at the moment with things like inflation going on and slow load growth. You would think it's obvious that there's a certain amount of attrition going on, but nonetheless, the issue is often raised. Another concern is the exaggeration of capex needs. The utility knows more about its capex needs than most of the other parties, although it actually doesn't even know the minimum cost capex requirements unless it's forced to discover them. But there's a concern about that, such that the prudence of tracked capex needs to be carefully examined. And in fact, so when you add up all these negatives to having capex trackers, the question fairly arises is that if, for example, utility needs something like a 2% annual rate growth every year, because of various forms of financial attrition, would it really be smarter to have a capex tracker to give them a little bit of relief from that, or something such as an automatic inflation adjustment or a customer growth adjustment that will not in any way weaken their cost containment incentives? Now, there are some pros to the capex trackers they do address an important attrition challenge, and so they will reduce the frequency of rate cases, either a lot or a little, depending on what's tracked. And if they do that, well, then there are stronger incentives to contain the costs that aren't tracked. And that can include some capex. For example, sometimes a capex tracker might just focus on really big ticket items like new generating plants and new new combined cycle gas-fired plants, for example. It's also the case that with reduced rate case frequency, there'll be more time and resources available to do other things. And so that time freed up could go into really examining the need for the tracked capex. But then, as we said, also, there are these other generic issues that the parties to regulation can consider. And you know that regulators really do care a lot about regulatory efficiency because very often it is the case, particularly in the United States, that they don't really have enough money to do a great job of establishing just and reasonable rates. So if there's some way to cut out an unnecessary cost of regulation, that's good news. All right, let's turn next to the topic of formula rates. Now, the basic idea here is now not just select costs, but most revenue is adjusted annually to reflect the utility's cost of service. In fact, that's where the name formula rate comes from, is a cost of service formula that typically trues up and makes the revenue trend very close to the company's actual cost trend. That might be okay if there were heightened prudence reviews, but in reality, oftentimes with formula rates, the scope and duration of prudence reviews is actually narrowed. So as for the precedents for formula rates, if you look on the map I have here, well, the map actually doesn't say something that most of you know, that formula rates are particularly popular at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where they do help to reduce the burden of regulating 80 plus power transmitters, and perhaps also to hurry into construction, new transmission plant at a time when it's really needed. But formula rates are also popular at retail, particularly as the map shows in the southeastern United States. In fact, the first state to use formula rates at retail was Alabama, and now in the electric utility industry, the states that surround Alabama also have formula rates for electric. You notice there are a lot more jurisdictions in the South that have formula rates for gas than for electric. And that's because the gas industry has for many years had a problem of sluggish load growth that takes away that margin that helps utilities self-finance their cost growth. You'll also note that there was an expired plan up north in a state of Illinois, and generally speaking, the Exelon company has been a big champion of formula rates in that part of the country. Now, let's talk then about the incentive impact of formula rates. Well, the problem here is not only is the incentive for capex containment weak, but also the incentive to contain the cost of all base O&M expenses. Look no farther, for example, than the U.S. power transmission industry that mostly operates under formula rates, and its several recent studies have shown that the productivity trend of the U.S. power transmission industry is markedly negative. And curiously, it isn't just the capital side of it, even the O&M side of the power transmission industry has been markedly negative for over 10 years. So for reasons like these, formula rates are often resisted by state regulators, such that they actually oftentimes require a legislative mandate where the legislator forces the regulator to use formula rates. And places where this has occurred include Arkansas, Illinois, and Tennessee. Any questions about formula rates before we go on? If not, I will jump into the performance-based approaches to rate making. Now, my definition of performance-based regulation is that it is all regulatory options that are designed to strengthen utility performance incentives. That really makes PBR the same as incentive regulation, a term which is actually used in lieu of PBR in some jurisdictions like Ontario, where it goes by the handle of IR. And there are four salient approaches to PBR. One is the performance metric and performance incentive mechanism approach that's gotten a lot of attention in the last few years in the US. Also, relaxing the link between revenue and system use, what I call targeted incentives for underused practices, and finally, multi-year rate plans. And each of these approaches can be used to encourage capex efficiency. So I'm going to be marching through these one by one. The basic approaches to PBR are often combined such that it's not unusual today to see a multi-year rate plan that has a bunch of performance metrics, a few PIMs, revenue decoupling, and some targeted incentives for underused practices. And a good early example of this is Britain's so-called RIO approach to energy utility rate making. But there are now many utilities in the United States that also can make the claim that they kind of have all four approaches to PBR going at once. All right, so let's talk a little bit about relaxing the revenue usage link. Basically, you want to make base rate revenue, the revenue that isn't having to do with the energy cost trackers. You want to weaken the link between that and system use. And that is desirable in general if the growth in system use either entails substantial negative externalities, or it might entail large costs for new capacity. And in the electric utility industry, you have both problems going at the same time, or at least the new capacity thing is coming down the road in places where they're serious about a beneficial electrification, things like electric vehicles and electric heat pumps. How to do this? Well, the revenue decoupling is the most common approach. And the idea there is to use a tracker and a rider to make the actual revenue of the company track its allowed revenue or revenue requirement more closely, such that effectively revenue and the earnings of the company are decoupled from the use of the system. As for the precedents for decoupling, California was the revenue decoupling pioneer, and they had it as early as the 1980s. And you can see from the map that decoupling is now generally popular in the electric utility industry in states that strongly encourage demand-side management and distributed generation. Decoupling is even more popular for gas distributors, again, because of this problem of unusually slow growth in system use because of things like the increasing efficiency of gas appliances and of newly constructed homes. Now, what then is the link between revenue decoupling and capex? Well, decoupling eliminates that throughput incentive to boost your margins through load growth. And along the way, it then gives the utility some encouragement to embrace distributed generation, but more importantly, a wide range of DSM initiatives that can be used to trim capital expenditures. Additionally, with decoupling, there's no need for high fixed charges that will discourage DSM and DG. And so here's a point that's not as widely recognized as it should be. Decoupling encourages innovative rate designs that can reduce capex. So time-sensitive rates would be a good example of that, but really the cutting edge of time-sensitive rates would be those that are time-sensitive for the base rates and not just for the recovery of the energy costs. And finally, decoupling, if average use of the residential and commercial customers is declining, decoupling will also modestly reduce the frequency of general rate cases, and that will provide, again, a little more incentive for utilities to contain capex. Does anyone have any questions about decoupling and its connection to capex? Well, then we'll go on to metrics, PIMS, and their relationship to capital efficiency. Now, a metric is basically a variable that is measuring some utility activity. And a performance incentive mechanism, or PIM, is a mechanism that links revenue to performance, usually where performance is measured using metrics and targets. And one of the most widely used applications of these PIMs is in the encouragement of utility conservation programs. And this is so even when the utility has revenue decoupling. And so it's important to understand why you might want to have both at the same time. And that is that the PIM will provide a positive incentive to actually use DSM in order to contain capex, or at least it's offsetting the reluctance that the utility has to do DSM that's going to reduce their capital investment opportunities. Another kind of PIM that has a lot to do with capex is those for peak load management, and they're increasingly popular today. You may have heard that there's a lot of interest in new PIMs. Sometimes they just say PVR when they really are only talking about the PIMs. And a lot of these proceedings have not come up with many approved new approaches. But one that is that's most likely to be approved would be a PIM for peak load management. And peak load management PIMs can be applied in a couple of different ways. One would be to reduce the system load peakedness, system-wide load, that is most important in the containment of power supply and transmission expenses. But then there's also the distribution side, a little different because what matters there is the peak at each local part in the system. And there, something called non-wire alternatives, sometimes going by NWA for short, to distribution grid investments is used. And an example here that most of you probably know about, have heard about, is the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Project, where they did an intensive use of DSM in a growing area of Brooklyns and Queens in order to forestall some costly investments in substation upgrades, sub-transmission lines, and the like. Now, there is another approach to encouraging capital efficiency that maybe hasn't occurred to some of you, and that would be something called cost benchmarking. In reality, cost benchmarking, statistical forms of cost benchmarking are used in many countries around the world today as part of the rate-making process. And in North America, sophisticated studies are used in at least 4 jurisdictions now, in order to benchmark total cost. The focus is on total cost, but capital is half of total cost of base rate inputs. And so, capital looms large there, but increasingly those studies will also itemize the performance of the utility in managing its base O&M expenses and its capital cost. So places where you can routinely see these kinds of studies filed include Massachusetts and 3 provinces in Canada. And without going into the gory details, I thought I'd give you an example of a sophisticated power distribution capital cost benchmarking studies. There would be 3 steps in such a study. And the first would be to develop an econometric capital cost model. Capital cost is a function of 8, 9 different business conditions. Then you go out and get data on cost in those business conditions, and you estimate the impact of each condition using econometrics. So once you have a parameter estimate for a whole bunch of capital cost drivers, you can take those and stick them into a benchmark formula for a specific utility. Important to note that you're using the specific value for all these cost drivers for the utility that you're trying to benchmark. So let's say you're trying to benchmark the capital cost of Rhode Island Energy. Then you start in with a formula that would have a parameter for the number of customers and so on and so forth, then put the whole formula here. And you can see that the benchmark would be reflective of the exact business conditions faced by, in this case, Rhode Island Energy. Now we'll turn to the targeted incentives for underused practices. That's my term for this. I've seen other terms used, but let me start by giving you a rationale for why you would even want to do something like that. Utilities tend to underuse certain inputs and practices, and in this presentation, the one we're most concerned about is practices that reduce investment opportunities. Maybe they're going to kind of shy away from those. And so things that come to mind here immediately would be utility DSM programs, any purchase of DSM services from third parties, power purchases, something they'd rather if you're vertically integrated, you'd rather self-generate than to buy power. Another thing is maybe that with a lot of facility maintenance and refurbishment expenses, you could avoid some replacement capex. And as a lot of you regulators know, that's a big part of the bill you're getting from the utilities today for capex in general is distribution replacement capex. So the idea is to use these targeted incentives to kind of nudge the utility in the right direction. So how could you do this in the case of capex reduction? Well, one of the most common approaches just be to track their costs, which will relax their incentive to contain the cost if they don't have a fixed budget for it. If they spend more, they get a little more money to pay for it, they're going to be more open to doing it. And the most common place where this is used is demand side management on almost all of the states of the United States where utilities have DSM programs will track the cost of those programs. Now, in addition, things you could do include capitalizing the costs if they are O&M expenses. For example, a few jurisdictions in North America capitalize DSM expenses. And another thing you may have heard about is so-called TOTEX accounting that's used by the British regulator. Instead of setting the capital cost or capital revenue requirement as capex, using capex plus a small amount of O&M, you just sort of come up with an equivalent amount of money where it's a share of total expenditures that include at least some, if not all, O&M expenses. Other things you could do is have a management fee for DSM expenses, something that they had in California for a while. And pilot programs for this, that, and the other thing that encourage capex containment. That's something that is you see more and more of these days. So any question about the targeted incentives before we go on?
I'll pause you for one moment, Dr. Lowry. We had a question from the Washington UTC. It was actually a little while back, but it was, what would some of the examples of how decoupling can trim capex? I don't know if that's...
Well, okay, I kind of did give examples that decoupling is going to encourage more aggressive use of peak load pricing. I mean, let's suppose that you wanted peak load pricing where you put a share of the recovery of base inputs in the peak charge. Well, that would create a risk for the utility. They don't know how quickly the price is going to drive load away from the peak, and so they're not going to be the first to propose time-sensitive rates that include the base rates as well as the energy costs. And just in general too, decoupling would, any form of another notable example would be any conservation program can be expected to be larger. The utility at least is going to have less objection to a large aggressive program if it has no effect on their allowed revenue. They're going to recover their revenue requirement no matter what. They're going to be more willing to do it. Okay, so let's keep going. Let me know if are there any other questions like that, Elliot. So we talked about how I guess we've covered the targeted incentive. Sometimes this kind of an approach falls under the heading of a regulatory sandbox where you encourage the utility to experiment. There are lots of ways that these approaches to incentivization have been characterized by various people who work in this industry. Now let's go finally, but last but not least, to the topic of the multi-year rate plan, which is really the biggest, most important tool for containing capex costs. And a multi-year rate plan has two key components, and then a lot of other things that aren't so key. But the two key components are, first of all, a reduction in the frequency of general rate cases, such that general rate cases will typically be only held every 3 to 5 years. Sometimes it's even longer than that, 7 years, 10 years has happened between rate cases. Now, if you're going to do that, you have to have some means of escalating revenue between rate cases because the utility's cost is certain to go up. Their cost is certainly go up for no other reason than the number of customers they serve is growing and there's inflation. So those reasons alone, there's going to be likely to be cost growth. So the trick with the multi-year rate plan is that's done by something called an attrition relief mechanism, which is a term that comes from California. And so the way it works is that it's going to automatically relieve cost pressures, but isn't linked like a tracker would be or a formula rate would be to the utility's actual cost growth during the plan. So you have infrequent rate cases, and even between the rate cases, you're going to have a means of escalating revenue that's not linked to the company's actual cost growth. So out of that, you would expect stronger cost containment incentives and streamlined regulation. And usually when regulators do approve an MRP, these are exactly the two things that they use as their main reasons for doing so. Now, this isn't to say that some costs aren't tracked. Energy costs, for example, will typically be tracked. You could also have tracking for some costs that are hard to predict, like maybe the cost of severe storms. And there are also lots of optional components. The most common thing would be to have PIMs for reliability and customer service quality. They're sort of not exactly optional. But then you could have additional metrics and PIMs. For example, the two most common ones that you'll see today is conservation PIM and a peak load management PIM. You could easily have cost benchmarking because with the MRP approach to PBR, a big focus is on good old-fashioned cost containment and not a lot of the other hoops that people want utilities to jump through. There can be revenue decoupling. I would almost say there usually is. Targeted incentives for underused practices, like you see a lot of pilot programs, and maybe a sharing of surplus earnings if they get substantially higher than the target ROE. So where are these multi-year rate plans used? Well, the first widespread use of them in the United States was in the railroad and telecom industries. But now, as you can see from this map, they're popular for retail electric utility rates. And they started in California and the northeastern United States, places like Massachusetts and Maine and the state of New York. But now you can see, too, a whole bunch of states in the southeastern part of the country, a lot of vertically integrated utilities. I mean, this isn't like a red state, blue state split in this approach to regulation. Two of the notable developments towards MRPs have occurred in two jurisdictions that traditionally were pretty conservative, North Carolina and Washington, where recent legislation encourages MRPs. In fact, Washington utilities are required to file MRPs now with their rate cases. You'll notice on this map that there's an MRP in North Carolina, and that just happened like a few weeks ago when Duke Energy Progress got the first MRP approved pursuant to this legislation. In fact, MRPs have become so popular that sometimes the name MRP is being slapped on things that aren't really MRPs these days. There are, for example, three jurisdictions, the District of Columbia, Illinois, and Maryland, where they now have rate making systems that are called multi-year rate plans that are really more like formula rates because they have something called a cost reconciliation mechanism that after a bunch of years you have to reconcile the revenue to the company's cost. Well, that's really what a formula rate does. So if you ever see you're having a proceeding and somebody submits sort of a little paper about precedents for MRPs. It shouldn't have Maryland, for example, in there because it's not really an MRP, in my opinion. MRPs are even more popular abroad. For example, Canada, right to the north of us, all 4 populous provinces of Canada and a couple of other provinces have MRPs now. And in fact, Alberta and Ontario are really kind of world-class MRP and PBR practitioners nowadays. And it's interesting to note that the impetus for MRPs abroad does not usually come from the utility. It's usually going to come from the regulators, or maybe it's going to come from policymakers, like in Canada, it might come from the energy ministry or the parliament. And this little quote in a box is a good example of that. The province of Alberta had been operating under a series of biennial rate cases for a number of years because utilities had a very high capital expenditures because of need to replace some older assets from an earlier boom cycle in this boom and bust economy. And so here's I won't go into the details of what it says there, but read it for yourself, a very stark admission that cost of service rate making does not work very well in this context. And we're looking for something with stronger incentive properties and probably more streamlined regulation. Now, I need to talk some about the arm design options, both because they are an important issue that's usually the most controversial issue in an MRP proceeding, but also because the way that these arms are designed has a lot to do with their capex containment properties. So I'm going to talk about 4 approaches, and one of them is I'll call predetermined revenue requirement stair steps, like you might, as the regulator, approve a 3% increase in 24, 2% in 25, 1% in 26. Those percentages will be a little higher in this era of a little higher inflation. And so, well, where would the capital revenue come from for these stair steps? Well, one thing could be a multi-year plan addition forecast of the utility. Really, they're not forecasts because if they don't get the money, they're not necessarily going to actually do that. So more like proposal would be a better word. Or it could be the commission's own idea of appropriate revenue requirement. But there are some other ways of doing this that are quite interesting and important. And one would be just to have a multi-year repate of the forecasted capital additions in the test year. Just take that amount and apply it to each of the next 2 or 3 years. Or to do, say, just take an average of the recent historical additions of the utility and say that is going to be your budget, maybe subject to an inflation adjustment for the next 4 years. So this general approach to rate making is used today in California, Minnesota, this new North Carolina plan, and in the state of New York. Now, one thing about this approach is that it does, if it relies on utility forecasts, there are going to be concerns about exaggeration of these forecasts. And so it's not uncommon with this approach that capex underspends are clawed back or sent back to the customer. And it could be 100% of any underspend, or maybe it could be a mechanistic sharing, like a 50-50 sharing with the customers. And this obviously weakens capex containment incentives. An example of one of these approaches is the Consolidated Edison of New York. You can see that it's a stair-step arm. They do have revenue decoupling. They do have PIMs for things like energy efficiency, non-wire alternatives, reductions in peak load, and managed charging. Now, another way you could do this is with indexing. Let's say the growth in the revenue cap index is equal inflation minus some sort of a productivity growth target, plus the growth of customers. And this is used currently in 4 North American jurisdictions. And I've been involved in many of these proceedings. And I can tell you that usually nowadays, the utilities are going to ask for supplemental capital revenue. They're saying that the index is not going to fund some surge in capex that they would like to do. And amongst these jurisdictions, you have these things approved in Massachusetts, Ontario, and Alberta. And now you're seeing it discussed in Connecticut, where the Connecticut regulator is interested in these revenue cap indexes, but the biggest utility in the state is saying, well, you know, if you're going to do that, we're going to have some form of supplemental revenue. And when it comes to capex containment, it's very important to note that the incentives differ a lot with these approaches. Like if you have a cost tracker, that's going to have the weakest incentives unless the cost tracker is applied to only a narrow range of capex. Another idea would be to have a fixed budget with a clawback of underspends. Well, that's what's done for the larger utilities in Ontario. You could have a fixed budget with no clawbacks. Here would be a case where you have a fixed budget and maybe the forecasts aren't even part of the rate case at all. And that's what's done in Alberta, and we're going to come back and talk about that in a minute. And the best thing would just be to have no supplemental revenue at all. So an example of where you'll see this is in Massachusetts. Here's the current plan for Massachusetts Electric, and you can see that it has a revenue cap index. They also have revenue decoupling, and they do have trackers for DSM. So there's an example of a targeted incentive for underused practices, but they also have a tracker for smart grid capex, and that's an example of supplemental capital revenue. A couple of other things you can do with ARMS is to have a hybrid where the O&M revenue is indexed and maybe a stair step for the capital revenue. And this has been used since the 1980s in California, where the commission basically mandated that everybody operated under multi-year rate plans. And it's actually currently used by one company. You can look it up, Southern California Edison. Another thing that would be popular is to track some of the growing capital costs, but otherwise freeze rates entirely. And that's an approach that's surprisingly popular at the moment, including in Abigail State of Rhode Island. Now, before I conclude, I just wanted to say a few things about, I've been maybe representing that some types of MRPs can strengthen capital containment incentives. And so, well, where is some evidence of that? Well, my company, Pacific Economics Group, is one that's done a lot of work in this area, including a paper published in 2017 by Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And what we did in that paper, among other things, was to measure trends in distribution productivity of utilities that were under multi-year rate plans or were just in a rate case stay out and compare them to the typical utility in the United States. And we focused on distribution because everybody has the distribution service. So some of you are going to be wondering, well, what do you mean by capital productivity? And well, the growth in capital productivity is going to be the growth in this case, the number of customers served. You could get fancier and maybe have a peak load term in there, but we didn't. And less the growth in capital inputs, the quantity of capital inputs. And that's kind of a complicated topic I'm not going to get into today, but I think it is discussed in that Berkeley Lab paper. So there was an interesting experiment there where Central Maine Power had been operating under a succession of 3 MRPs with very limited supplemental capital revenue and price cap indexes. That they were more popular before concerns about DSM became more paramount. So it'd be interesting then to compare how the capital productivity growth of Central Maine Power during those years compared to that of the Northeast US. And you can see here that actually Central Maine Power's capital productivity growth was 3 times that of the Northeast US. And it was high in general because actually today capital productivity of most utilities is negative or it's close to 0. So 1.72% during that era was really quite remarkable. And here's another interesting story about the incentive impact of capital. Because in Alberta, as I said, the regulator got tired of the rapid run-up in costs and the high regulatory costs of biennial rate cases by utilities there. We actually, in a recent proceeding there, measured the capital, O&M, and multi-factor productivity of all the utilities in Alberta, and actually published an article about this in the June issue of the Electricity Journal. And you can see that the capital productivity of these utilities under these biennial rate cases was really a sad story. It was negative and was getting worse at the time that they finally decided to make all the utilities go on PBR. However, the utilities did not like the particular formula that the commission chose, and they took the commission to court, and they won. And so the commission was then obliged to think of some way to provide them with some supplemental capital revenue. So in the first generation of PBR, they decided to do that with a broad-based capital cost tracker, so that essentially not only was capital costs not subject to the same strong performance incentives as O&M, but it could even be worse incentives than under biennial rate cases. And you can see from our study that that's exactly what happened, that productivity growth, capital productivity growth was terrible during the years of that plan. And if you have a multi-year rate plan with a cost tracker, or if you have a formula rate, you can expect kind of the same kind of thing. And so that was what happened. But then, interestingly enough, in the second round of PBR, one of the commissioners, who was a PhD economist from University of Alberta, had an idea to give each utility a plan addition budget for each year of the next plan that was the average of its plan additions during PBR1. And there was then no consideration whatsoever of their forecasts of capital costs during the 5 years. And the prudence of their capex was not going to be judged until the end of the plan, when the next rate case occurred. So you can see what happened to capital productivity growth under this strongly incentivized system, and that was that it surged. Unhappily, it didn't go positive, but as I said, that's not really to be expected in this day and age, because there are a lot miscellaneous reasons why a lot of utilities need some capex, so capex productivity growth isn't necessarily going to be positive. So in conclusion, we live in an era where there are high capex needs, and it's a big driver of cost growth. And so capital efficiency should definitely be a key goal of regulators. And I think I've shown that available rate-making options yield varied capex incentives. If you're just looking at cost of service rate-making today, particularly if a utility is on like a 5-year program of replacement capital spending or something like that, its incentives to contain costs are not very good. And the incentives with formula rates are even worse. Now, as for the multi-year rate plans, they have the potential to offer substantially greater capex incentives, but depending on the details, it may actually be no better than continuing under cost of service rate making. I think I've also shown that the other PBR approaches can help revenue decoupling, and these targeted incentives for underused practices and PIMs can all play some role, particularly a peak load management PIMs. And finally, I can tell you, as a person that's been involved in a lot of these proceedings to develop complicated new rate-making systems, that if utilities have high capex, and you want strong capital efficiency incentives, good luck, because it's really hard to design something that is going to be reasonably compensatory to the utility, but causes them to be efficient in their use of capex. That said, if indeed they are in a period of high capex, it's vital to somehow squeeze these incentives into the plan, because it is probably the main source of their revenue growth and the cost growth for the customer. So with that, I will then be happy to take some questions.
Wow, Dr. Lowry, thank you so much. I felt like you were really definitely speaking directly to the experience we've had in Rhode Island. And I imagine that everybody in the other states found something within your remarks that resonated with them too. So I would just start by inviting any of our participants to raise your hand or even just speak up if you have questions. And maybe while you're thinking of your questions, everybody, I'll just start with maybe going back to closer to the beginning of your presentation when you were talking about revenue decoupling. Do you have any thoughts, or have you seen any examples from states that are trying to encourage electrification, but also have revenue decoupling? How much of a disincentive for load growth do you feel like decoupling provides or imposes? And have you seen any modifications to decoupling mechanisms that would share new revenue with the company?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. As you know, living in New England, Abigail, this was an issue in a recent rate proceeding in Massachusetts where they're gung-ho for everything green. But there is this conflict between the revenue decoupling and the promotion of the electric vehicles and other forms of beneficial electrification. I mean, you want both. And in my opinion, I think that decoupling is worth keeping and finding another way to promote the beneficial electrification is basically my thought. Now, one way that can be done is to simply exclude beneficial electrification loads from decoupling. That's an approach that I believe is part of the new legislation I mentioned in North Carolina. I think it's North Carolina that the electric vehicle loads are exempted from decoupling, but decoupling is otherwise, in practice now. So that's one thing you can do, and that's not such a crazy idea as you might think by any means, because very often revenue decoupling doesn't apply to large load customers, and there's good reason for that. I mean, one of the reasons, probably the biggest one, is that it's very important to get your rates to those customers just right so that they don't leave. And maybe you can draw new customers to the service territory with low rates. And so, decoupling kind of gets in the way of that because you're going to get your revenue requirement whether or not you lose load X or load Y. So it's not a big deal to exclude something else from revenue decoupling. Now, another thing you can do is to track costs of beneficial the cost the utility incurs for beneficial electrification. And that's an approach among other places where I know that is now done is the state of Washington. They're tracking those costs. So if the utility is knocking themselves out to promote progressive electric vehicles, for example, if they're incurring costs, they're going to get more revenue for that. Now, thirdly, you can have a beneficial electrification PIMS, a reward for a good job at beneficial electrification. And if the listener goes back to the Con Ed slide, you will see that they have that in New York State for Con Ed and a number of the other utilities, a separate reward. And they have decoupling. So they keep the decoupling, and yet they'll have a separate reward for the beneficial electrification. Now, remember when I said earlier that MRPs were first used in the context of railroad and telecom? Well, those were both industries where marketing was really important. The service was not considered to have negative externalities. They wanted more use of the system, and this is very much part of the plan to go at to have for utilities to be incented to expand the use of their system. So it was well recognized at the time and should be now that giving the utilities some incentive to promote these new load growths is a normal part of regulation.